Time's River. Chapter 4. The U. Mandy. Traveling around the next bend, wondering when this night might end, and I might pause my quest and have some sleep. I thought I could not take much more, when on the stream, quite far from shore, came to my ears the bleating of a sheep. Balanced atop a floating log, drifting faintly through murky fog, I saw it, a plaintively crying ewe. Just downstream the river's pouring, o'er a fall with mighty roaring, convinced me all at once what I must do. Swimming hard out to where it lay, before timber could float away, I seized it and swam back with just one hand, then towed it out of current's reach, exhausted, fell upon the beach, beside her there, safe upon that dry land. Warmed by cozy woolly fur, I soon fell fast asleep with her, and dreamed of things familiar, yet strange. But when I woke, with light of dawn, both log and ewe were vanished, gone. From cataract she sighed, "Not all can change." The town had decided, for fiscal reasons, to make some organizational changes to the structure of the school system. As a result, the other middle school would be closed, the facility sold to a private organization. We were still calling them junior high schools back then. Apparently, at some point, it was decided that this had a pejorative connotation, and so some touchy-feely type had decided middle school was better. And so they have remained ever since. In order to accommodate the burden of additional students in the one remaining middle school, it would be reduced from a 3-year school to only 2. The 9th graders would be divided between the 2 high schools according to the already assigned districts, taking advantage of the comfortably large facilities that previous town councils had been forward-thinking enough to have provided. The net effect on the student body in general amounted to not much more than a little more crowding. The effect on the town's 9th graders of this quite promising and newly discovered gold mine was perhaps not expected. It didn't even matter if you passed this year. You were still going to move along to high school, even if you were the dumbest slug in creation. On top of that, the effect on me was simple. I would not have a year's respite from the oldest of the boys in the current school. Rather, I would get to add to them all my old friends from elementary school, since that district footprint fell entirely within the confines of the new one. Joy unspeakable. Of course, the most fearsome of my current adversaries had been removed from the board. Over the course of the coming summer, the local papers would dig out every detail they could glean from anyone willing to talk to them, and proudly trot it out to us like a hunting dog presenting a freshly downed fowl. The boy's father had been compelled to leave the home, reportedly over threats of charges being filed for abuse, total loss of custody of both the boy and his younger sister, that sort of thing. The mother had, unfortunately, very little in the way of income, as she had been up to that point a full-time housewife. The small earnings she had been able to secure with some secretarial work were undoubtedly insufficient to replace the missing contributions from the father. When the wheels of bureaucracy eventually ground forward to require support from him, this strain might be alleviated, but such things can move terribly slow, particularly if one party has a grudge and enough money squirreled away to hire an attack dog attorney. Gossiping neighbors had eagerly reported all this and more, and the yellow rag scooped it up and dutifully distributed it to Felicia McElroy's friends and neighbors, despite the fact that her son was dead. As a result, she had to pile, on top of her grief, the aggravation of the pointed questions about the men she had been spending time with, despite the fact that the divorce was not yet final. Another helpful soul had apparently alerted Edwin McElroy that this was going on, and after fueling up on plenty of liquid courage at a local watering hole, where he had vented his spleen on the matter to anyone who would brave the monsoon of spittle he spewed to hear the tale, he had returned to his former home and broken the lock, armed with a gun of some kind — law enforcement kept this detail under wraps — and lain in wait for her to return. Matthew's unexpected arrival had likely saved her life at the cost of his own. Speculation ran that he had put up a violent struggle, no doubt pleading with his father before the man callously destroyed his only son in a fit of blind rage. Paradoxically, he appeared to have left the weapon behind and fled, rather than wait for his wife and continue his furious melee. Other speculators, many of them alkies themselves, and not entirely strangers to chemically induced regret, suggested that upon sobering somewhat and realizing his horrible actions, he had perhaps been overwhelmed with remorse. Some even blamed the booze entirely and declared him not responsible for his actions. Whatever his motivations, he had definitely fled. The apartment he had rented since leaving his home was thoroughly searched and showed signs of a speedy departure. Perhaps fearing identification and pursuit, he had left his vehicle there in the driveway. The reigning theory was that he had fled to Mexico. I'd given a great deal of thought to what my dream might have meant in the weeks after I learned what had happened to Matt. Of course, from my dream, I already knew the address, and one Saturday I had ridden my bike down that street to see the place. I dared not walk onto the property or even stop as I rode by, but I could see enough to verify one thing. The house was definitely the one I had entered in my dream. The lawn was running to riot now, and of course it was the middle of the day rather than late at night, but it was the place. I could clearly see the yellow bug light bulb in the porch light socket. I had no doubt that if I went inside, I would recognize the interior as well. How could this be? Was this the ESP that people talked about? And why would I see such a thing? More importantly, what did it mean? I'd hoped that my trip would prove that it was just a coincidence. But instead of answers, I found only mountains of questions. And worse, I felt responsible, as though I should have done something to stop what happened. Ridiculous, I told myself. Even if you were somehow watching because you hated him, there wasn't anything you could do. I assured myself this, but I didn't really believe it. The simple truth was that with so many unknowns, it was impossible to really know anything about what had happened, and it was pure insanity to even contemplate telling anyone else about these thoughts. So, in what was most likely a defensive measure, I blocked most of these things out of my mind as much as possible, and for the most part, everything else as well. I passed the grade, but only because the grades earned in earlier quarters in the year buoyed the final quarter up to a passing average. I doubt I opened a book in May or June. I began to try harder to participate in the youth group activities at the church on Fridays. Subconsciously, I suppose the quest for a new friend must have been on. I only knew I wanted to do something because doing seemed safer than thinking at that point. The church, i.e. my folks, rented Christian films and showed them on Friday nights on a finicky old projector, which I ran, as part of the church's community outreach. At this point, my attitude toward the church had begun to change. In the past, I would have been volunteering for the job to be seen to be doing my part. Now, I was back there because it meant that I didn't have to participate in the other activities, singing, clapping, things like that. Instead, I could busy myself preparing the equipment, and no one gave it a second thought. The films themselves were, for the most part, comically hokey and corny. Some childish and oversimplified, some meant to terrify the viewer into rethinking their position. A trilogy of this latter variety featured prominently a guillotine, which was presented as the punishment which lay in store for those who missed the rapture and were left behind to face the outpouring of God's wrath, but who miraculously still wanted to throw their rings into God's camp and not take the mark of the beast. A clear case of danged if you do, danged if you don't, if I had ever seen one. So I sat there as Kevin's logic played over and over on continuous loop in my head, and I began to silently mock these stupid movies. And when the movie was over, there were, as there had been when I had been an Episcopal years before, snacks. The church had also managed to partner with a local roller skating rink to give the kids in the lower income section of town, where the new church building had been located, something fun to uplift them. The place was poorly lit, with fluorescent black lights and neon day-glow foam-covered surfaces. And they still played their own music during these events, though an approved subset. As I skated around the floor, if I closed my eyes, I could pretend that I was just a normal kid. It was wonderful. One of the maneuvers I liked to perform was to get going as fast as I could. I didn't know how to use the toe stops at that point to drag a toe to slow down, though. I would just aim for one of the support columns at the edge of the skating floor. These were all surrounded by a massively thick cylinder of padding, and I would stretch both arms out to my sides and crash into the pole at full speed, and upon impact, hug the pole to prevent from being bounced backwards onto my butt. Then I'd circle around and do it again. And that was how I met Amanda. I had reached maximum velocity, selected my target, and was closing in toward irreversible impact, when suddenly, a girl with glowing teeth and a glowing purple t-shirt, there was a black light directly overhead, skated, grinning, into my path and expertly used her toe stops and looked straight into my face as she grinned. In retrospect, it is a wonder that one of us, or both, didn't have our teeth knocked out. Unable to do anything else, I plowed into her, knocked her backward, and pressed her into the foam padding around the pole. As I did so, my arms locked around both her and the neon cylinder to prevent rebounding off, and I stood there, pinning her to the cushion. She looked directly into my eyes and said, "All you had to do was ask." And then she kissed me full on the mouth. A tiny bolt of lightning arced from my brain into my toes and back again. Her lips were warm and moist and tasted faintly like tobacco. After some indeterminate, but all too short, period of time had passed, she pressed her head back into the cushion and disengaged. Her smile was halfway to a smirk, with mischief dancing in her eyes. "My name is Amanda, but you can call me Mandy." In the weeks that followed, I began to express a profound interest toward participating in Friday Night Youth Group. Mandy lived in the neighborhood near the church, a few blocks away, and I looked for her at each service. There were few opportunities for us to be alone, as all the usual functions were well supervised. Our first encounter, for lack of a better term, had only been made possible by the limited lighting of the roller rink. Still, I sat near her and talked to her whenever I could, mostly about nothing in particular. I still had to run the projector, so I couldn't sit next to her in the dark during any of the movies. But there were the fellowship periods afterward, with the snacks. It was during one of these events, while I was waiting for her to return from getting some more Kool-Aid, that one of the older boys who attended spoke up. "Looks like you stepped in some dirt," he chortled. "Huh?" I replied, looking at my shoes. "No, not there. There." He pointed at Mandy's back. "That's what everybody in the neighborhood calls her. Dirt. 'Cause she's a dirty little slut who throws herself at every guy at school. We all know better and steer clear of her, but it looks like she's stuck to you," he laughed as he walked away. I didn't say anything to Mandy about it, but I felt odd all the same. I was used to being ostracized and ridiculed for the outrageous crime of being myself, and it just figured that instead of having a connection that might actually lead the way out of that isolation, I find someone who only reinforces it. It was a petty, selfish feeling, and I hated it. But it didn't stop part of me from feeling that way just the same. I tried to see Mandy one Saturday that August. I rode my bike to the other end of town, to her house on Spring Street. Normally, the houses in my neighborhood, where girls lived, had this quality that told you girls lived there. Sometimes, if they had swings in their yard, they'd have pink swings, or a girl's bike in the yard, or sidewalk chalk scrawled all over the driveway. Conversely, boys' houses had similar but opposite telltale signs: a basketball hoop, a tire swing, a boy's bike, perhaps even a tree fort. Whenever there was an only child, these houses seemed to me to exude this fundamental gender identity. Larger families confused these voices in a cacophony of conflicting signs. Mandy's house had none of that. From the street, it looked to me like the kind of place where an old couple lived. People who never went outside, who paid someone to come and mow what little scraggly lawn there was. Not even that, really. It looked more abandoned. There were no toys, no life, no color at all. The place looked drained, as though a vampire could suck not the blood of a person, but the vitality from everything they possessed. I didn't want to approach the front door. Don't be stupid, I chided myself. It's just a boring old white house. And it was white, but there seemed to be a darkness about it all the same. Nothing you could really name or quantify, just a little too much soot around the base of the chimney, perhaps one too many spider webs in the corners of the overhang of the front stoop, or a tiny excess of dirt or dust in the corners of the windows. One window in particular was open. All the others were closed with the shades drawn. This window on the second floor had a desk lamp positioned close to it, but the light seemed feeble and cast no illumination on anything further in. I parked my bike on the sidewalk and approached the front door. The plastic button of the doorbell was dark, cracked and split with pieces missing. I knocked gently at the door instead and waited. No response. After a minute or so, I knocked again, a little harder this time, and added a plaintive, "Hello?" I heard running footsteps coming downstairs inside, and in a moment, Mandy came to the door and looked out through the curtains. Her expression was not the same as it normally was. She looked frightened and anxious. She opened the door a crack. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, and I felt a chill on the back of my neck and a prickling of the fine hairs there at that. "You need to go." I hadn't called or let her know that at the previous night's movie that I had planned to come over. I just wanted to see her. "Can't you come out?" I asked, disappointed. "My father doesn't want me to talk to boys. She started to say, but was interrupted by a harsh shout that came both from the gap in the barely open door and from the open upstairs window. "Mandy! What have I told you about having boys over? Get back to your room, you little whore!" Her eyes were wide with terror. She muttered, "I have to go," and shut the door. I heard the bolt slide home and her footsteps as she ran back up the stairs. I walked down the sidewalk to my bike out by the street and looked up to the window. The desk lamp had been turned off, and barely perceptible in the gloom beyond it was the pale glow of a man's face, lit only indirectly from the glare of the sunlight shining on the white concrete sidewalk where I stood. "Go on, get lost!" the man shouted at me. "There's nothing for you here! Scram, you little bastard!" Then he slammed the window closed and pulled the shade down. A moment later, the desk lamp turned back on, casting its feeble glow on the yellowed shade. So I rode home. I couldn't leave things that way, yet I couldn't get any time with Mandy at the church to talk to her so I could find out what was going on. So I came up with a plan. I told my mother that the kids at the church were probably sweltering, since none of them had pools in their yards. They had a community pool at the neighborhood center, but the one time I had been there, the thing had been so heavily chlorinated, no doubt because of all the kids peeing in it, that it reeked bad enough to make my eyes water just standing near it. I hadn't gone in. "Wouldn't it be nice," I suggested, "to let them come here and swim in a proper pool?" In truth, I couldn't have cared less about the rest of them. I only wanted Mandy to be on my turf for once, so I could have her to myself. And after all the smelly winos that my parents had brought home over the years, I felt they owed me this much. The kids would probably just pee in our pool as well. They didn't appear to me to be touched by the things my parents were trying to do for them. They just seemed happy to have a sucker to give them things. I didn't care. I thought that, in this case, the ends did indeed justify the means. It was agreed that this would be a wonderful opportunity for the children, and so, at Friday's youth group, the invitation was made for the coming Sunday, after church, a pool party with hamburgers and hot dogs provided for lunch. Permission slips would be required, as my folks didn't want any trouble with lawsuits. My heart sank when I heard this. There was no way Mandy's father would agree to anything, I thought. I was wrong. When we brought the van to the church to pick up the kids, Mandy was there, permission slip in hand, smiling at me, and I was elated. After eating lunch, I suggested that some blackberries would make a great dessert, and told Mom I was going to go down to the river to pick some. Both Mom and Dad were still quite preoccupied with feeding the others, with many calls for seconds, and I was waved away absent-mindedly. I asked Mandy if she wanted to go berry picking with me down by the river, and she agreed immediately. She had stripped down to her bathing suit to swim. a one-piece aquamarine and green patterned affair. She put on her sandals and we set out on foot. As soon as we were out of sight of the house, she began to apologize. "I'm so sorry about my father. If I had known you were coming, I would have told you not to bother. Frank doesn't like me seeing anyone," she sighed, rolling her eyes. "I hardly ever get to go out anymore. The only reason I was able to come today is because he thinks if I go to church that some of that holiness will rub off on me." We walked in silence for a while, until we got to the path that led off the road to the berry patches, which ran along the edge of the train tracks, which in turn followed the course of the river. As we crossed over the train tracks, she stopped and stood defiantly, facing the length of track to the south, and yelled, "Screw you, Amtrak!" When she looked at me, I must have had a questioning look on my face, for she explained, "My little brother got run over by a train last year. Amtrak said they're really sorry and all, but that there's nothing anyone could have done. I hate them." "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "It's okay. Maybe they're right. Maybe you can't just stop a train that's going full speed. But I swore to the cops when they asked that I had never heard any horn. They didn't even blow the horn. They just ran him down like a dog in the street." I didn't know what to say. "That's terrible," I commiserated lamely. She seemed not to notice. That was when it all fell apart. My father kept saying it was all my fault, that I should have been watching him better, and my mother kept saying that there was nothing anyone could have done, and that it wasn't fair to blame me because they didn't blow the horn, because she believed me. Then he would say, "How do you not hear a train coming? Anyway, that's bull squat. She's just lying because she knows it was her fault." And they went on and on like that for months. Finally, he came home one night, stinking drunk, and when she told him off, taking my side, he hit her, punched her in the face, broke her jaw. The neighbors called the cops because of all the yelling. He told her that if she didn't tell him she tripped and fell, he'd kill her. Mandy sighed heavily, then continued. So she lied, told them it was an accident, and he didn't have anything to do with it, and the police bought it and left. But he must have scared her bad, because that night she disappeared. I think she ran away to her sister's place in Maine. She talked about doing that once, more than once, actually. We'd arrived at the blackberry bushes. I now believe they were black raspberries, but neither of us seemed intent on doing any berry picking. Occasional cars crossed the nearby railroad crossing with the thump-thump of their tires across the double set of tracks. Mandy had a trickle of tears flowing down one cheek. "I'm not really hungry, and I don't feel like having them staring at us," she gestured to the railroad crossing. "Can we get away from these tracks? Somewhere private?" "I know a place," I said, and of course I did. I knew all the woods along this piece of the river. We started walking. That was just before Halloween last fall. Since then, he just got meaner and meaner. He started looking at me funny. At first, I would catch him watching me from around the corner. Then, she broke off. She stopped and looked into my face. When my mother would get really mad at him, she had this way of saying his name that really ticked him off. She said, "Frank!" So one time, when I caught him staring at me like that, I said, "What are you looking at, Frank?" That's when he hauled off and slapped me. He slapped me so hard I saw stars. I had to stay home from school for a week until the red hand mark on my face faded. I balled up my fists angrily and was about to castigate him in absentia when she laid one of her hands, cool and soft, over my fist, and she led me on, continuing toward the river. I could have lived with that, because I knew he wasn't slapping me. He was slapping my mother, but since he couldn't reach her, he was hitting the only thing he could reach. I was glad the mark was there. I would have been proud to go to school and show everyone what a jerk he is, but he wouldn't let me. And then, when the mark had faded, he came home drunk again. I was asleep, and he came into my room. Suddenly, I didn't want to hear any more. Suddenly, I thought I knew where this story was leading, but was unable to stop it. He sat down on the edge of my bed. That's what woke me up. I could smell the booze pouring out of him. He reached out and stroked my hair. "You know I love you, Amanda. I don't want to hurt you." I was scared. I didn't know what to say, and so I didn't say anything. He leaned over sideways and laid his head on my stomach. He continued muttering, "I love you, Amanda," until he fell asleep. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed there, frozen, until my alarm went off for school. When that went off, he got up, shut it off, and stumbled back to his room. I think he was still drunk, and by the way he was snoring a few minutes later, I'd guess he had probably taken some of the pills he has for his back pain to boot. I went to school, and I was afraid to go home, but I had nowhere else to go. But that was the day they started looking for that guy, the guy who killed his kid. Frank got all weird after that. When he heard that booze was involved, he stopped drinking completely. At least, I think he did. He didn't come home drunk anymore. But he got more strange every day. He started yelling out his window at kids in the neighborhood, and he wouldn't even let me talk to boys. Now he hardly ever lets me out of the house, and I'm afraid. I hate him. We had reached the river. "There's a secret spot I used to like to go to down here when I wanted to be alone," I said. It was as if she didn't hear me. "That's why I like being with you," she said. "At first, I just wanted to be with someone, anyone, because I would rather be with someone I choose than with him. But now," she patted the hand she still held, "I only want to be with you. You're different from the other boys. I know what they call me behind my back. I guess this world still holds to the idea that boys are supposed to choose and girls are supposed to wait to be chosen. But sometimes," she said, looking into my eyes again, "time is a luxury you can't afford." "Here's the spot," I said, "right in here." At this point, a small creek fed into the river, and a narrow path led away from the water's edge back toward the train tracks. But after 20 yards or so, the path curved and led into a deep bowl in the hill, surrounded on all sides by steep slopes leading up into the rocks, screened in by dense trees, except the narrow, low spot that faced out toward the river. I had spent many hours in here in peaceful solitude, though I hadn't been here since the days I spent wandering and debating along the river with Kevin. "Wait, something's not right," I said as we entered the little glade. There were bags of debris. It looked like someone had raided a Salvation Army drop box, and there were all kinds of clothes of all sizes strewn about. Furthermore, someone had dragged a mattress into the clearing. It looked like some bum had denned here. This stuff wasn't here the last time I was here. She smiled that same mischievous smile I had seen the day we met, and her eyes danced. "It's perfect," she said, and led me to the mattress. She leaped toward me and crashed us both to the ground on top of the mattress. She pressed in close and said, "I've been waiting to pay you back for crashing into me at the roller rink. Today I get my chance," she said, and then reached up with both hands, clasping them behind my head, and pulled me toward her and began kissing me. It might have been a minute, or it might have been 10,000 years. I have no idea how much time passed. The next thing I knew was when I heard the sound of brush being crunched underfoot, above and behind us. Mandy leaned up to look at the intruder. From behind me, I heard a deep but vaguely familiar voice say, "Hey, that's my spot! What are you kids doing in my spot?" The bum continued into the glade. Mandy stared at him and said, "You're that guy, the one from the newspaper." I rolled Mandy off of me and scrambled to my feet and whirled around. In front of me, much disheveled but unmistakably not in Mexico, stood Edwin McElroy. Mandy pointed at him and looked at me. "That's the guy I was talking about, the one who killed his kid. That is so weird." Edwin scowled. "I was drunk. I didn't know what I was doing," he sulked. "Yeah, that's what they all say," laughed Mandy. "Come on, Winston, let's leave. This loser is stinking up the place, and it's spoiled the mood." "Oh, I'm afraid you won't be going anywhere," Edwin declared, moving around to block our exit through the gap toward the river. "Wait, did you say Winston? So you're the little turd that tried to get my boy kicked out of school? Yeah, you're both going nowhere." As he said this, he unsheathed the cheap machete from a flimsy cloth scabbard which hung by a metal clip from his belt. "I'm not going to prison, certainly not on account of you two. Since you've recognized me, I have nothing left to lose," he said ominously as he advanced on us. Matt had been large for his age in any case, in addition to having been held back in school. It was evident that he had inherited this trait from his father's side, as the man was huge. The thought of trying to overpower him was ludicrous. "Wait," Mandy cried, realizing that things had suddenly become much more serious. "We won't say anything. We hate the cops." "Sorry, girlie," Edwin menaced. "But even if I believed you, which I don't, I'd still have enough reason to settle this turd's hash," he replied, waving the machete at me. And suddenly, everything was clear in my head. I had a perfect image of what I needed to do. One moment I was standing there, shivers of terror beginning in my limbs. The next, I felt as though someone had poured liquid steel into my blood, and my next steps blazed in neon before me. I stepped in front of Mandy and shouted, "You're not supposed to be here!" and bit the edge of my tongue as hard as I dared. I felt a small pain, but nothing else happened. Edwin halted with a shocked expression on his face. "What did you say?" he demanded as he raised the machete high above his head with his right hand. I stepped forward and seized Edwin's left wrist with my left hand. Then I put the edge of my tongue between my teeth again, and as Edwin brought the machete down, I did the only thing I could think of. I brought the heel of my right palm up as hard as I could and slammed it into my chin. A tremendous gout of pain flared inside my head, and as the salty tang of blood filled my mouth, the world around me darkened. Mandy, the clearing, the mattress, they all faded, and were replaced by the poorly lit shack from my nightmare. The waves of nausea that had assaulted me that night were back. The shotgun was once again in my hands, and in front of me, seemingly back from the grave for an encore performance, was Matthew McElroy. "You're not supposed to be here!" Matt shouted. "No, not again," my other voice wailed. Only now I understood. It was not me who was speaking, even though it sounded like me to my own ears. I was experiencing this event from inside Edwin McElroy's head. "No," I muttered, with a mouthful of pain, blood, and a swelling tongue. "This time you do what you should have done the first time. This time you make it right." I grabbed the twin barrels of the shotgun with his left hand and socked them into the soft hollow of his jaw, rotating his grip so that his right thumb extended through the trigger guard. I looked into Matthew's suddenly shocked eyes and heard both of my voices say, "I'm so sorry, Matthew." Then that thumb jerked and the world exploded. When I awoke, I was lying in the grass in the clearing. The summer day was all but gone, the sun well behind the trees on the western shore, but not yet set. Mandy was gone. Edwin was gone. The mattress and all the debris were gone. I was alone, in the grass of the glade as I had remembered it before arriving there that day. As I spat, there was still enough light left to see that my spit was filled with crimson and tasted like salt and something else. When I had spent part of the summer, years before, exploding rolls of caps with a brick, great clouds of sulphurous smoke had puffed out from each explosion. What I was tasting was what those clouds had smelled like. I was tasting gunpowder. I staggered to my feet and made my way home as the last light of day faded. There was no sign at home of all the kids from the church. I asked my father, "Did you take Mandy home?" He looked at me with a puzzled stare. "Who?" "The girl I went blackberry picking with," I clarified. "Did she go home with the other kids?" "What other kids? What are you talking about?" he asked, becoming more confused. He set down the block of wood he had been whittling. "You know, the kids from the church pool party," I said with failing hope. "Church pool party? Hey, that sounds like a great idea. I bet that would really cheer some of them up, huh? Good idea, champ," he beamed as he gave me a faux punch on the shoulder. "Hey, Josie, "The boy has a great idea," he called out as he marched off to tell my mother. They discussed it excitedly and agreed they should do just that next weekend as a last hurrah for summer before school resumed shortly after. The next morning, Frank or no Frank, I rode my bike to Mandy's house. I parked my bike as before and walked up to the front door. As before, the upstairs window was the only one open and the desk lamp was on, but there was some music I didn't recognize wafting down from the opening. The doorbell had been repaired, it seemed. It was intact, giving out its faint orange glow. I pressed it and heard the bell ring. A few moments later, I heard heavy footsteps approach and then the sound of the bolt being withdrawn. Mandy's father opened the door and glowered at me. "Yeah, what do you want?" He was surly, but not in any way that suggested he recognized me from our last encounter. I figured I'd try the carrot rather than the stick and be as polite as I could be. "Can I speak to Amanda, sir?" His former surliness looked like Fred Rogers compared to the countenance of rage he showed to me now. "Get out of here! You're a sick little bastard, you know that?" he shouted out to the neighborhood behind me. "You're all a bunch of sick little bastards, and you can all burn in hell!" Then he slammed the door with a tremendous boom. The echo of that sound echoed like cannon fire down the narrow street. The entire door frame vibrated, and one of the panes of glass set in the door fell out and smashed on the cement step. I backed away, horrified. As I reached my bike, he hung out the second-floor window and screamed, "You ever come back here, I'm calling the cops!" And then, seeming to consider that an insufficient threat, he added, "If you're lucky!" Then he slammed the window as well, but not so hard as to break the glass in it. I got on my bike and began to ride away when an old lady next door called out to me. "Hey there, Sonny," she croaked. She had apparently been weeding a somewhat small but very crowded flower box on the front of her house. She had been hunched over while doing so, wearing a yellow and white plastic sun hat, and now arched her back to a small fusillade of cracks and pops. "You boys really shouldn't do that. I know they say his wife ran off, but I remember some of the things that were yelled in those fights they used to have. I called the police the very night she disappeared. I thought for sure he was going to kill the poor woman, and I'm not entirely convinced that he didn't indeed do precisely that." "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm just trying to find out if Amanda is okay," I explained. "You mean you don't know? Oh, I'm sorry, Sonny. Young Amanda died about 3 months ago. No, wait, it was 4. In April, that was. Poor thing took her own life. Overdose of some pills, police said. I just know she died of a broken heart after her mother disappeared. That little girl loved her mother dearly, you know. Why, I remember..." But I wasn't hearing anything else. Dead? 3 months ago? My mind raced in utter confusion. "Over in St. Patrick's now, down by the river," the old woman continued. "I'm sorry, but this is all a bit of a surprise to me. Amanda is dead?" I asked her. "Yes, dear. I'm very sorry. As I was saying, she's buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery now. Poor thing." I didn't go to the cemetery. I went to the library. I found the archived newspapers for that day and found this in the local rag. March 16th, 1982. Newfield Ledger. Local man dead. Police were called to the home of Felicia McElroy, where the woman's estranged husband, Edwin McElroy, has committed suicide. The couple's son witnessed the event, but no one else was home at the time. The deceased has been cremated in accordance with his wishes. In addition to wife and son, Edwin is survived by a younger daughter. My head seemed to be spinning. I continued to scroll forward on the microfiche, stopping on the obituaries for each day, until I found this. April 8th, 1982. Newfield Ledger. Obituaries. Amanda O'Leary. Amanda Christine O'Leary passed away at home on Thursday after a sudden and unexpected illness. Born in Hartford on October 9, 1970, she was the eldest of 2 children of Frank J. O'Leary and Christina O'Leary. This shocking blow to the family comes less than a year after the tragic loss of their younger son, Michael, to a railroad accident. Services will be held on Saturday at 3 p.m. at Flaherty Funeral Home, followed by interment at St. Patrick's Cemetery. Around me, the world seemed paper-thin. Figures loomed around me in a fog. They may have been librarians. I left the film in the machine and simply walked away. I didn't even unlock my bike outside. I just kept walking. I walked all the way to the cemetery and found the newer section where recent residents were being added. Walking past the most recent one to each previous, I felt like I was moving backward in time. July, June, May, April. And here it was, a rose granite headstone with her name and her dates of birth and death. And between them, all there was to show evidence of any of the life she had lived was a dash, a 2-inch groove etched into the stone. Only I knew that it should have been longer, because she had lived on past April, but somehow the change that I had made had snuffed her out like a candle. She was gone because of me. I looked into the cold, dead eyes of the Virgin Mary carved into the block to the left of Mandy's name, and demanded to know, "Why? Why? Why?" But of course, there was no reply. I embraced the stone and bawled, screaming, "Why?" all the while. I think there were people who passed by at some point, but I paid them no mind. My wounded tongue was like a hot coal in my mouth, and I didn't care, and I screamed on, and a light rain began to fall. At some point, I fell asleep. I was looking at a 3-dimensional microfiche. I could zoom into any place and then rewind or fast forward or pause and watch the people, the cars, the animals, the sun and stars all whirling by or stopping at my command with the simple push of a button, the movement of a joystick. There seemed to be limitations. I rewound and found I could go no further than a certain point where I seemed to be looking at myself as a child. Anything before that just washed out and became blood. Fast-forwarding became increasingly difficult and painful, so I returned to the present by letting go of the stick, and the pain subsided. I rewound slowly then, counting back the days as arcs of light across the sky. I moved my position and zoomed in on the house on Spring Street, Mandy's house. I continued to rewind, slowing down as I approached April 8th. Police cars materialized on the street, and I continued past them into the previous night, until a light in a window, other than the one that had been slammed on me, appeared. I zoomed into that window and saw Mandy looking into the mirror, tears streaming down her face, taking pills out of a bottle in the medicine cabinet. I shouted to her, but she could not hear me. I zoomed in through the window and tried to take the pills out of her hand. My hand simply passed through hers. I rewound further, slowly. I followed her as she walked backward, turning out the bathroom light, into her room, where she climbed backward into bed, crying inconsolably. I watched for a while, helpless to comfort her. Then suddenly, her door opened, and her father staggered in, backwards. He turned to look at her and zipped down his pants. And suddenly I understood everything. How the monster which had been growing within him had changed when struck by the news of Matt's murder. It had become the talk of the town for weeks. The simple suicide of Edwin, however, had hardly raised a blip in the town's radar. As a result, Frank had had no moment of epiphany. My mind recoiled from the horror of this knowledge before I could see any further. I zoomed out and out and out until all the world was an invisible dot and all around was blackness, and I knew no more. I awoke, chilled to the bone by the damp, still clutching at the gravestone. The first gray light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. I left the cemetery and walked home. The house was still quiet, and I let myself in with my key. I went into my room and picked up an item and some change from my dresser. I went quietly back out and found a payphone booth. I looked up the listing in the book hanging there and found what I sought. I deposited a quarter and dialed the number. After several rings, a groggy voice answered. "Hello?" "I know what you did. I saw the whole thing. You killed her, and I am going to make you suffer." As I spoke these words, pulses of darkness flashed before my eyes. My voice was once again a hoarse croak after all my screaming. "Who is this?" "I am Death, and I am coming for you." I looked down. In my hand, I watched the plank as a new word etched itself into the wood. It now read, "Lost eyes find lies."